after they have formed that alliance. Again, keep in mind that the people of Gibeon were able to successfully deceive the Israelites in chapter 9 by presenting themselves as being a people that were from a very far country. And we know, of course, that the Gibeonites did a very good job of that deception, being able to disguise their possessions, their food, things of that nature, to make it look as though they were that they were warned. And the consequence was the Israelites entered into an alliance with a group of people that were Canaanites, and naturally the people were upset by that. And as we're going to see, that alliance is going to be tested once again, now that we talk about an attack on Gibeon. So what are our key points this morning? First of all, one thing that we need to think about as we look at this passage is that we cannot be discouraged by the fact that the enemy does not give up. And this is certainly true for the book of Joshua. The Israelites will never, the Israelites don't really have a moment where they are able to kind of take a break from dealing with their mission in this book, right? Again, the mission to go and conquer these people, to claim the land as God has given it to them. There's not really any time for a whole lot of rest. And I know that sometimes as we think about our lives as Christians, we understand that we often are hit by one thing after another. We face temptation, we face temptation, we face problems that the world throws at us. Sometimes it may feel like it happens over and over again without much break. But the point is that the Israelites in this book, and again, as we see in this chapter, are not going to throw in the towel, because they have to, once again, come to the defense for God, or come to the defense to do something that God expects of them. As 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 58 indicates to us, as Christians, we have to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. That would, by implication, include at times where we feel like we get fatigued for being a Christian. That's something that we want to think about as we look at this passage this morning. The other thing that we need to think about is that as Christians, we need to have an unmatched zeal to do what God wants. We'll note, of course, Joshua chapter 10 records one of the more famous accounts, one of the more famous miracles in the Bible that we have recorded for us. And that miracle, in large part, comes because of Joshua's zeal to solve this problem that afflicted the Gibeonites, but also certainly was a problem for the Israelites as well. So we'll come back to these two ideas as we move through these 15 verses this morning. But we begin looking at this first section, and that is verses 1 through 5. And we're going to call this a coalition against Gibeon. And this is going to be because of what had happened in chapter 9. And Dad, if you don't mind, could you read for us verses 1 through 5? Joshua 10, verses 1 through 5.
Now it came to pass, when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and her king, so he had done to Ai and her king. Now the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. But they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men thereof were mighty. Wherefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent unto Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to Japhiah, king of Lachish, and to Deber, king of Eglon, saying, Come up unto me and help me, that we may smite Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their hosts, and encamped before Gibeon and made war against it.
All right, so we notice here that there, again, is a group of kings that are going to form an alliance, much like what we saw at the outset of chapter 9. So what prompts this alliance to be created? Well, we know that it's prompted by the very same reason that the people were greatly afraid of Israel, and that's because of the things that we've already seen. We've seen the Israelites come to different military victories as they did at Jericho and Ai. And even though we might not think about what happened in Joshua chapter 9 as a victory because the Israelites were deceived, for the people of Canaan, again, based on what we have here in verse 3 from the perspective of Adonai-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, the fact that the Gibeonites are no longer on their side, they've been removed from the picture, and that they are allied with the Israelites, what that means is, at least from the perspective of these Amorite kings, they feel as though Israel has gained a victory. Again, they don't have to deal with Gibeon, right? That's something to think about. Another thing to think about is the fact that now, because of what has just happened, the Israelites have successfully divided Canaan in half. Again, this gives us a map of where kind of we're at, and it doesn't necessarily give a full map of Canaan at this point. But by the time that Jericho, Ai are defeated, Gibeon has made peace with the Israelites. If we look at a map, basically what Israel has done is, at least from the Jordan River, for the most part, the Israelites have split Canaan in two halves. You've got a northern half that will come into play later on in the book, and then you've got a southern half, and that's the half of Canaan that's being talked about here. And for the kings of these cities, they recognize that this is a problem. Again, because Israel has been able to cut Canaan in half, there is no ability, at least, to coordinate with the kings of the northern half of Canaan. There's no ability to coordinate with them and be able to attack the Israelites, which is a serious problem. For instance, if you go back to World War II, the German army, or the Germans in particular, were able to quickly get France to surrender much quicker, what they obviously could not do in World War I. But in World War II, the reason why Germany was able to so quickly force France into a surrender, even though France was a much larger country, was simply that the German plan was to divide France in half, where most of the French army was stationed along a lot of the same lines as World War I to defend against an invasion from Belgium. And so a good part of the German army simply swooped in behind them and cut them off, and especially cut them off from getting reinforcements from France lower to the south. And that was the point. If you divide the enemy in half, it's easier to defeat them. That's essentially what the Israelites have done here. And that's why in chapter 10, in these first 5 verses, that these people are greatly afraid. They're afraid because, yes, Israel's victories through God, but also because now the people that they can allied with, that number is essentially cut in half. And so that means that the remaining groups that are in the south, they have no choice but to ally, at least in their minds. So one thing that we take away from this is obviously that the fear of the Lord provokes different responses. We understand that the fear of the Lord sometimes motivates people to either harden their hearts, to remain stubborn, to kind of keep them set in their ways. Again, that was the difference between Gibeon, essentially, and these people. You know, the people of Gibeon said, you know, we're afraid of the Lord. We've got to figure out a solution to preserve our lives. But on the other hand, these kings, because they are afraid of what's happened, it's only made them more devout in their opposition to the Lord and their opposition to the Lord's people. Now, for all of us in here, if we think about Proverbs 1 and verse 7, the writer tells us that the fear of the Lord does what to us? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? For us as Christians, I know we think about fear in that sense as a sense of respect, but we understand that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? We respect the Lord. That's why we obey him. Sometimes we are motivated out of the fact that we don't want to suffer eternally, and that motivates us to obviously obey him at times. But the point is, people have different responses to the fear of the Lord. Some people respond appropriately, hopefully as we do, where we seek the Lord as a consequence of his power and what he can do. These people act a lot like the world. They know the power of God, but that only hardens their resolve against him. I'm reminded of you may have watched the debate that several years ago that Kyle Butt had with Dan Barker, and I'll never forget that Dan Barker in that debate said, well, if God has essentially sent my mother to hell because she didn't believe in God, well, that's where I want to be. So some people's resolve is, some people's knowledge of what the Lord can do only hardens their willingness to continue to reject him. And that's what the kings are going through. What we also see is that the coalition wants to put this alliance to the test. Again, this is a new alliance. Time has not been, essentially you haven't had a whole lot of time for this alliance to grow. And obviously that's where the test will come in. You might recall after the Revolutionary War that the U.S. and French alliance was put to the test under President George Washington, where several French ambassadors came to the United States requesting America's help in its revolution and in part fighting against Great Britain. And it was a relatively new alliance that George Washington, as it turns out, wisely decided to not go and help the French. Sometimes new alliances are not very strong. And that's the thinking of the Amorites. If this alliance is new, it hasn't really been tested, maybe we can break it. Maybe we can get the Israelites to not honor the agreement that they have made. The other thing that I want to point out in these first 5 verses is this indication or this designation that these 5 kings represent kings of the Amorites. The term Amorite carries the idea of people who live in the mountain or people who belong to the hills. You recall back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16, God told Abraham that he would give his people the land once the iniquity of the Amorites was full. And so again, that's what's happened in the book of Joshua. The iniquity is full. But I want us to think about for a moment the Amorites are these individuals that the Israelites are supposed to destroy, but they are thought to be the people who lived in the mountains. Now, the reason why that's important is because if you think about in the Old Testament, when you consider the concept of the mountains or the hills, in the Old Testament, a lot of times that is a direct reference to idolatry. For instance, if somebody would read for us Deuteronomy 12 and verse 2, and then somebody read for us Ezekiel 6 and verse 3. Deuteronomy 12 and verse 2, and then Ezekiel 6 and verse 3.
Deuteronomy 12:2, you shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which you shall possess serve their gods upon the high mountains, and upon the hills, and under every green tree.
All right, and then Ezekiel 6 and verse 3.
Say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord God. Thus says the Lord God to the mountains, to the hills, ravines, to the valleys. Indeed, even I, will bring a sword against you, and I will destroy your high places.
So one of the reasons why the mountains and the high places in the Old Testament are often connected to idolatry goes back to the concept of who the Amorites were. The most idolatrous people who, based on their name, were the people who lived in the mountains. And that's why in the Old Testament, moving forward, the high places, the mountains, that there's a connection with that and with the concept of idolatry, just simply because of the designation of who the Amorites were. That's something that I didn't really understand until, you kind of put 2 and 2 together. Because you do read about the high places and whether or not kings in the book of Kings destroyed, removed the high places. But that's the reason why it's connected to idolatry. It's because of the concept of the Amorites. And again, what we see here is they are not going to let go of their way of life without putting up a fight. It's not one of these things where the Israelites have conquered these two cities and then all of a sudden these idolatrous and wicked people are simply going to give up, right? They're going to bend the knee, that they're going to submit, that they're going to make it easier for the people of God to do their work. You know, sometimes as Christians, we have to keep in mind what these people are realizing. The work of God for them never got any easier. They had God's help with them, but it didn't necessarily get easier because they kept doing it over and over again. You know, obviously as Christians, we grow in our knowledge. We grow in terms of our abilities, but the point is that it will never become so easy to do the work of the Lord, right? The opposition that the devil throws, the opposition that the world throws, just because we might be successful in what we do, that doesn't mean that they're going to quit. And again, this is a reason why we as Christians have to have a zeal to continue to do the right thing. We cannot be discouraged whenever we feel like, you know, this isn't getting any easier, is the point. It didn't get easier for the Israelites, but now they're going to have to, once again, come to the rescue, and that's exactly what essentially we have to do. The world keeps throwing obstacles in our way of doing the work of the Lord. We have to come back just as strong to complete it. And there's the map of the area. So now, verses 6 through 11, the Gibeonites turn to the Lord for help. Again, turn to Israel, and by consequence, God for help. Again, notice verse 6. The men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, "Do not forsake your servants. Come up to us quickly, save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered against us." All right, so we note here that the men carry out a tremendous march. As it says, verse 7, Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And so the Israelites, to go from Gilgal to Gibeon, and I'm going to go ahead and put this up here to give us a map. But again, we're talking about from Gilgal, just due west of the Jordan River, all the way to Gibeon. That is some 35 kilometers, or I think roughly 30 miles in our way of measuring this. But this is a quick call to action here, that the Israelites and that Joshua have to make a decision. Is it really worth it now to go and defend is it really worth it to take the time to go fight and protect the men of Gibeon? Notice that Joshua, of course, provides words of encouragement. Again, verse 8, "Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand." And again, this is God saying this to Joshua, but Joshua, of course, delivers this to the men. "Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you." And so Joshua, therefore, came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. And certainly we know that traveling at night, some of us may not like the idea of traveling at night. But again, these are men that, don't have, modern equipment, don't have electric lights, anything like that. They carry out a 35-kilometer march going all night, which would have taken a long time, which would have meant that the people were tired. But again, what we get from this is that Joshua is concerned about maintaining this alliance. And again, in order to help motivate Joshua and the men, God provides words of encouragement. If you go and look at the book of Psalms, Psalm 34, verses 4 through 5, that's a hymn that a lot of times we sing at camp. And it is a very, very good hymn written by David. But the premise of that hymn, or the premise of the hymn, is essentially to seek out the Lord. Sometimes the song is called "Come Taste and See That the Lord is Good." And the point of that song is to seek out the Lord for encouragement. Joshua is given this encouragement. The men are given this encouragement. And again, it reminds us of one of the reasons why we study our Bibles is that when we deal with the obstacles that the world, that Satan puts before us, really the only way that we get encouragement is not by looking to other people in the world, but one of the ways that we get encouragement is by seeking out the Word of God. Again, Joshua and his men don't necessarily have the completed Word. Joshua, is directly told by God, you will be successful. I've given this enemy into your hand. And so for us as Christians, again, we study our Bibles to seek encouragement. If I feel like at times where I am discouraged or I am sad, or if I am dealing with issues that are very overwhelming to me, the best solution to that is certainly to seek out the Lord's advice about it. He can give encouragement that the world cannot give. And he can give encouragement that is a lot of times in the proper way than what some seek from the world. So they have encouragement, right? God's going to be with them. They're willing to carry out this march. And it's really important to keep in mind the fact that the Israelites could, in theory, have abandoned this alliance. When we go back to Joshua chapter 9, essentially what the alliance said was the Israelites are not going to kill the Gibeonites because the Gibeonites will become the servants of the Israelites. That alliance, at least based on what we have in Joshua chapter 9, did not indicate that the Israelites were required to go and fight for the people of Gibeon. At no point was that ever stated in that alliance. But as we talked about last week, again, God expects us to be faithful to our promises. But in this case, even though it may not have specifically laid out that the Israelites were required to do this, Joshua felt called. The Israelites felt called at this point to now go and protect his people. In other words, the Israelites were willing to go above and beyond to show that they were willing to honor this agreement. If we think about this from a personal perspective, we may have a contract or we may come to an agreement with somebody to do something for us, right? Maybe we pay them to help do something with our house, or we pay them for a service or something of that nature. And it always stands out to us whenever we hire somebody or we pay somebody to do something for us and they do a job that is well above and beyond what we expected them to do, right? It makes us feel good. It makes us appreciate who we have hired to help us out. People in general notice when people go above and beyond at their job, and that's a quality that people, that's a quality that I think we all admire when people have that, and that is in essence what Joshua has here, right? And the people of Israel, they're willing to go above and beyond to help the Gibeonites out here because it will reflect well on the Lord. It will also obviously serve them as well in terms of dealing with these people. And so the Israelites were not just people who honored their word, but they would also go above and beyond what other people expected to help out those who needed them. As Christians, we can take away a lot of application for that we're called by God to do the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing means going above and beyond what other people expect us to do. So we notice that man essentially has a part in this, but it's not just man, but God obviously has a part in this as well. We notice that, again, verse 9, they came up upon the city of Gibeon. They marched all night, but as verse 10 indicates, it's the Lord that routed them before Israel. He killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. So what is the Lord's part here, right? The Lord causes a panic among the Amorites, the kings of the Amorites, right? That's verse 10. The Lord routed them before Israel. Again, when you think about in a military conflict, a rout often takes place when the enemy decides to retreat for whatever reason. We know that there are times in the Old Testament, whether through an angel of the Lord or whether through some other means, that God calls the enemies of his people to rout and completely abandon their task. Again, we notice here that the Lord also provides large hailstones from heaven to continue raining down on them as far as Azekah. And it says that they died, and that God essentially, through these hailstones, killed more of these Amorites than the children of Israel were able to kill with the sword. And, we don't necessarily think about this being a scene that we want to look at, right? And I mean, even people who, we would see as enemies, especially in a military setting, right? We still don't think it would be pleasant to watch them die. But, one of the things that this does show to us is as a reminder that when we do our part, we don't have to worry about God doing his part. Again, when God promised that as they were marching toward Gibeon, that God had already delivered them into their hand. And in other words, God was going to be faithful to honor what the Israelites had done by doing the right thing. Does that through a panic, does that through these large hailstones thrown on the attacker. And as a consequence, this is why the Israelites are successful. They had a part to play. They played their part. And that was really where the question was were the Israelites going to honor this alliance? When they made that decision, God had already made his decision about what he was going to do, right? He was going to reward the faithfulness of his people by being on their side and giving them the aid that they needed. Again, and this comes in a very spectacular way, at least up to this point, large hailstones thrown down, and that is going to kill a lot of people. Up here you got a picture of, hailstones, right? Rather large hailstones. But naturally, the hailstones that are referred to in this section would have been much larger than this. Obviously, we know that hailstones of this size can cause a lot of damage to vehicles, houses, and things like that. But again, to think about the hailstones that rained down from heaven, those probably were a whole lot bigger and a lot more of them to be able to wipe out to kill a lot of the men of these Amorite kings. Of course, we think about in the book of Exodus as well, God used hailstones as well to carry out his mission, to try to get Pharaoh to let the people of God go, using hail, of course, to destroy their crops and a lot of the property. And again, the point stands that God was more than willing to do his part to honor the faithfulness of his people. And then now, of course, in probably the most famous scene in this account, is now Joshua is going to make a request of God. Verse 12, then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Again, it would be hard for us to imagine the sun standing still for an entire day. And if you're like me during the summertime, that would be an awful thing for the sun to stand still for an entire day. You can certainly imagine it would be much hotter for a long time for that to happen. But why does Joshua want to do this? Well, it goes back to that second key point. Joshua had a zeal to do what the Lord said. Joshua wanted this problem to be eliminated. And if it meant that he was going to call upon God to perform this miracle, so that he could complete this job. Well, that's exactly what Joshua was going to do. Naturally, we know that the Israelites probably were tired. They probably were fatigued. Keep in mind, they have marched 35 miles or 35 kilometers in the middle of the night and have essentially started and engaged in a battle that obviously at this point has lasted hours. And by implication, based on verses 14 and 15, this is when we talk about what they've done, they've marched 35 miles, but then they go, by implication, they're going to go and hit a lot of these cities where these kings are at before they return to Gilgal. You're talking about a group of people that are fatigued, that are probably tired, that are ready to take a break. But Joshua's call to God is, give us more time, at least give us more daylight to complete the job. And that's exactly what they want to do. The point being for us is that Joshua's zeal and the people's zeal is what led to this outcome, where the Gibeonites are protected and that Israel is thereby protected as well. But sometimes we have to realize that doing the work of the Lord means that we do the work of the Lord even if we are tired. And we understand that there are times where we have to rest. There are times where we have to kind of take a step back and recharge and things like that. But the point is that because the world is so relentless, because Satan is so relentless at trying to stop the work of the church, to try to cause us to sin and to stumble, we are going to feel tired as Christians. But the point is, we can't use tired and the concept of being tired as an excuse to stop doing the work of the Lord. I tell my students that all the time, that you're taking a college class, and I get that maybe you're more tired than you normally are in a normal class, but in college, they're not going to use tired as an excuse. You don't get to the end of the semester and say, I'm tired, and then expect the professor to all of a sudden go easy on you. It doesn't work that way. And as Christians, sometimes we might feel that as we get older, yes, we get more tired, and that means that God expects less of us because we do get tired more easily. Well, it's not necessarily the case, right? There doesn't come a point where we've done enough for the Lord where we can start to say, well, I'm tired, I've done enough, I've done my part, and I don't have to do any more. Joshua and the people were willing to do whatever it took to complete the job, of course, being aided by this miracle that is performed. We notice that in verse 13 that this instance is recorded in the book of Jasher. And obviously this is not a book that we have in the Bible. A lot of people seem to think that the book of Jasher was perhaps a book or maybe a collection of songs that commemorated great events in Israel's history. Certainly in our country we have songs that are written that are connected to great military feats, or songs that are written during times of war that become popular, that are passed down. For instance, the Star-Spangled Banner, a commemoration of the War of 1812, our national anthem. We still sing it today. This perhaps is a book of songs or a book of poems or short stories that people still read about. And obviously instances like this would be very memorable in Israel's history. And as it says, verse 14, simply, there has been no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp at Gilgal. Because in order to defeat these 5 kings, the point being is that they had to go to essentially these cities, right? Pursue them all the way, defeat them before they were able to return to Gilgal. So again, the key takeaways: we cannot get discouraged because the enemies of God give up, and we have to have a zeal for the Lord that is unmatched, because it is what lets us continue to persevere, to follow after God, even spiritually speaking, when we get tired. People of God here are a good example of that. Are there any final thoughts or comments, questions before we close this morning?
Just think about the simplicity that God uses to accomplish His will. Men to defeat these Canaanites would try to come up with some type of mechanical invention or some type of superior military invention. God just used hailstones,
Right.
and in nature, Jesus calmed the sea just by speaking.
Right.
Just the power of God, yet the simplicity that God uses to accomplish His will.
Right. So we'll see next week. Israel is going to continue to pursue after these kings, and that will help us, complete the map. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning. We'll pick up in verse 16 next week.